everyone, welcome to Zannen, Canada. I'm your host, Jesse Betteridge. As always, this is a podcast focusing on the connections between anime and Canadian media. And joining me is my good friend, long time, I guess for the longest time we would say that you were pretty much a co-host in the show, but it's actually been almost 2 years since you were last on, Karl. It's Karl Olsen, everyone.
Hello, everybody. It's Karl, aka Ultraclystron, who does theme music for the show and so on. And yeah, no, it has been a minute, but it's because you've had many illustrious guests able to turn up and speak to different topics, which is something is a better choice than just having me on for the sake of having me on. But I think for what we're talking about this episode, I am an applicable guest. So
I agree. And I also have to point out there have been numerous long hiatuses, also as a result of my decision to just not have the two of us chat randomly as often. And the reason we're doing it this time is because the day that this episode is going to be released, or probably be released, is going to mark a very terrifying anniversary. It is going to be the 20th anniversary of Zannen Canada as a brand, as a blog, as a podcast, as whatever you think of Zannen Canada to be. It's going to be 20 years old. I don't know. I guess there's worse ways to spend 20 years of your life. Yeah, Karl, you've been at least on the sidelines of this whole thing since the beginning. Do you remember it all? It all started with like a thread on ToonZone.
I can't
if anybody remembers ToonZone.
The rough part, and I came up the other day out of sort of a very weird set of conversations on Blue Sky that made me go try to look up some old terrible reviews I did. I was like, oh my god, none of that stuff was archived on archive.org. And so all of the, it would have been great to look back and be like, who nudged who into like you doing this and looking back at that thread specifically. But if the articles aren't archived, much like many forum threads, and to be fair, many other forums, so much of that stuff is now very solidly in the lost media category now, and with very, very unlikely to be recovered. So I don't know the details for sure off the top because it has been so long, but I do know that was something that came out of, I think in some ways, ToonZone only having so much capacity to cover stuff, and you having the knowledge and perspective there to cover it. So I put it this way, had you asked me back then, I definitely would have been like, oh, just do a blog, thinking like that's normal, even though that was not. But growing up in Seattle, I thought it was normal.
Yeah, see, I don't think anybody told me to do it. So maybe let's break this down. If you're not familiar with ToonZone, it was a news website about animation, and it had a very large forum. Some might say the forum overshadowed the website.
Oh geez, like it never happened with any forums and their associated websites. Yeah, I mean certainly not like the most notable forum of the O's. That certainly was not the case with its front page content. No, I mean it was interesting though. Yeah, there was definitely a time where ToonZone's forum preceded the reputation of its news, but the news was great, and it was something that provided me with skills that, if not directly fungible, still have left me in better stead than many of my peers in STEM.
Yeah, and ToonZone does technically still exist, but we've talked about this on the show already. It's under the name Anime Superhero.
I tried to go to the Anime Superhero site as part of this chase with Blue Sky, and nothing was loading. So I don't know if that properly exists right now, or whether there's in the middle of like site something rehashing or whatever, but yeah, it's for a long time though it was quite a force. It got name dropped on Adult Swim.
Yeah.
It was the kind of thing where if you told an animation studio or an animator, hey, I'm with them, it would open doors. I got to go tour AKA Cartoon in Vancouver because of that. I got to see all sorts of screeners for shows well before they aired because of that. Like it being a albeit unpaid volunteer reporter for a media conglomerate that was always, I guess, technically in the red. Hey, still what the work that we were churning out had some respect on it, I guess.
Yeah, the forums were a bit of a weird place. I remember it took a really long time for them to have an actual dedicated anime forum. They were resisting that for some time. They preferred to just kind of throw everything together and categorize it differently, which I almost, that was almost kind of admirable in a way. Everything was always divided based on American television. Of course, you had there was a Toonami forum, there was an Adult Swim forum, there were forums based on the way that you saw shows in America, and that dominated the discussion. But there were lots of people from around the world, and so much of the discussion was colored by the Toonami fandom. And Toonami at this point of time, which was like between 2001 to 2003, this was that kind of golden time where we were at the height of the Pokemon craze. Anything that aired on TV was going to have like a heightened impact. Very brief period of time, but you could throw anything on TV and it was going to be better received, and better received than it would be, I think, at any other time before or after on Cartoon Network, at least. The big thing was that none of these shows were airing in Canada. We've talked about ad nauseum on this show before. YTV aired Gundam Wing. It didn't. Obviously, they didn't have a lot of faith in the show, and we just didn't get most of that Toonami stuff for that 3-year period. And as a pretty obnoxious 17-year-old, that really annoyed me. And no one told me to make a website or a blog. I would just, complain about it on Toonzone a lot. And I said, I'm going to go make my own website where I complain about this and bring attention to it and, make real changes in the world that matter. And you're all going to understand why this is important. It's not just going to get buried under all this US-centric stuff in this forum. And I had no idea what I was doing. Honestly, I never had any idea what I was doing. I still kind of have no idea what I'm doing with all of this. Behind the scenes, like, I don't know what the fuck's going on. Yeah, I just kind of grabbed together whatever connections I could. I knew the guy who ran Sonic HQ, Zifei Wu, who was... He wasn't on Toonzone, but a lot of people on there knew him through other communities. He was running this website called pathea.net. It was a really unfocused animation site because at this time he was just kind of trying to get something off the ground, some kind of brand. And I asked him, like, can you host my website? And he said, sure. You can just write a couple articles for this site. So I wrote some bad articles on pathea.net, and he just hosted my website for a couple of years. And that's kind of where everything took off. There was no domain name or anything. I was just had this very, very hostile, very tasteless, poorly researched and conceived website called Zannen Canada, thrown together with Japanese that I've learned in high school. Although I will say, Zannen Canada as a brand, as a phrase, I think has held up extremely well because it's catchy. It's catchy, still it's short, valid 20 years later.
Yeah, it's catchy, it's short. I don't think it will ever not hold some weight in some capacity. But no, I think I mean, honestly, sometimes you're very lucky when you pick branding when you're a teenager because it makes perfect sense for what you're doing for the next, chunk. And then sometimes you're like me and you pick a name that makes a lot of sense for like doing drum and bass music. And then you start doing rap and you're like, that was too many syllables for that, but I can't change it now. And that kind of thing, so you got to take the wins and the losses there. But it's, no, I mean, I've always, the interesting takeaway from it, especially with the context of like recently trying to be like, I just need to find this article where I like reviewed terrible like Miss Dr. Seuss tie-in pancakes so I can throw it up as like a joke, and I can't because I entrusted even my goofy work, let alone the more serious stuff where it's like I interviewed Koge Dombo, I interviewed like all these folks, like interviewed Travis Willingham, who was VA for Funimation, all these folks. All that stuff is like tears and rain, and so that aspect of the foresight of being a impetulant 17-year-old saying, I'm just going to build my own website and write for that own website as if it is as important as if I had been at least getting free DVDs to write for somebody else's website like I was, turned out to be the better thing long term, because if I had put the same effort into something, whether that was just literally under my own name as a personal thing, or I tried to come up with branding the way other folks had, the fact of the matter is some of those other folks, even if they're now writing for ANN or writing for other sites or still just writing on their own, they still have all that content. It still exists. And I think looking back now 20 years, the fact you still have all this stuff and it's yours and you know where it is, and if you want to say like, I'm going to put this all up on Internet Archive to mirror it, and you have all of that for sure on hand, where I'm like, ooh, did I upload that directly from the SDCC? Do I have any of these?
You know what? I don't have.
It's gone.
A lot of the old stuff I don't have backed up. It is currently on the Wayback Machine.
But that means you did that right.
Far more of it than I would care anybody be able to find is indeed on the Wayback Machine. And if you, I don't know if the oldest iteration of the website is on there. If you were around then, you'll know the website basically had like a newsy blog on the front page, which I guess was pretty much the only place, one of the only places reporting Canada-specific anime news. There was Pan's site, Lilola.net, of course, and a couple others. That was kind of on the decline at that time, around 2003. But I spent most of the time, all those shows that were airing on Toonami, like Tenchi Muyo, G Gundam, The Big O, the stuff that we weren't getting. I just wanted to incessantly complain about that. I wanted to complain about how badly Teletoon dropped the ball, or was dropping the ball, in not picking up these shows and brazenly abusing their position as the animation channel in Canada. And I had special pages on the site where these are all the problems with Teletoon, these are all the problems with YTV stuff, and these are all the shows that we're missing. That's what I felt needed attention in the year 2003, where like nothing else was going wrong in the world at that time.
Well, and how, and honestly, how could you have known that they would eventually lead to such important moments in Canadian anime style things and connections like Spider Riders and My Life Me?
Well, see, that's
you
the funny
have known
thing.
This.
That's the funny thing. In 2003, like I launched the site July 18th, 2003, and literally like less than 2 weeks later, YTV announced that they were airing Inuyasha that fall, which is basically what the thing I wanted.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, oh, what do I do now? And I just kind of winged it from there. So yeah, and somehow I have kept it going for 20 years. That site it was originally on, pathea.net. I actually looked into it again. Apparently, it's now a game company based in China. And Zifei Wu is the creative director of that company. So he also started that brand, wasn't quite sure what to do with it, held on to it, and turned it into something where he's obviously making a lot of money, whereas I'm just losing money on this podcast now. I have never made a dime off of Zannen Canada. When I was on Pathea.net, I did start up a little forum and stuff, and we did have a community of people who were posting. I don't think you were there too much, Carl, but that's where we met.
I don't even know if I signed up, because
yeah.
I think it's like you and me are just on ToonZone with your little Pepperidge handle, which is clever because it's like your name, but it's not. It's referential, and it was. And the thing is you started up Zannen in Canada not too long after Ben Applegate, who is then known by his handle Twage, and who is now, some sort of god king over at Random House with regards to manga. I don't he keeps getting promoted, and I haven't kept up. But it's just talk about the things that you start just out of habit and youth, and you're able to kind of parlay forward. Great example of that. But the thing is, he pulls me in to start, writing and be a mod. And that was second year a mod on a forum. That soaks up a lot of time, especially if you're trying to do community college and work a job at the same time. So it definitely hyper-focused my attention on basically one forum. I kind of had to mind ToonZone. It's like, did I have a PayPal account? Could I have thrown $10 and hung out on something awful in all these other places that were very vibrant points in the internet? I'm like, yeah. Did I have the time for that? No.
we had a little community going. I know Ian was there. He followed from ToonZone, and a few others who have been on the show over the last few years were on that community as well. It was ultimately it was not that active, and I just kind of had to kill it after a certain point because I didn't feel it was worth maintaining.
Forums are hard.
Yeah, they really are. And also just finding hosting for a website is also hard. I was only on that place for a couple of years. Then I had to move it over to another site run by a guy I had met in person at some conventions in Vancouver. It was anime-source.com. It was supposed to be like a catch-all anime website, but it was actually just mostly a torrent website. But I had a domain name at that point, zannen.ca, which I have held on to all that time. So I didn't have to worry about anyone knowing what site my site was actually connected to. I could just do my own thing. It was also around this time that I gave the site a major visual upgrade. It was something I dashed together on Dreamweaver for the longest time, and again, it looked pretty terrible. My good friend from high school, Sam Delmont, he actually very generously threw together a much better looking design for the site for me, made it a lot more functional, made it look a lot better, made it easier to navigate, and I stuck with the design he created for quite a long time, and that had a really big impact on things. But yeah, I still just kind of chugged along, doing what I was doing, complaining about whatever I could complain about. I want to talk a little about Teletoon later in this episode, but Teletoon was always a nice big target for me, because there's lots of good things we can say about Teletoon, and we should focus on the good things because the English version of the station is gone now. But
to a real one, which is wild.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty crazy. But they always made themselves an easy target. But I would still try to get that news out there. I know it did get the attention of like Christopher McDonald, who plugged the site as much as he could, or was able to get people to over at Anime News Network. And I'm still surprised by how many people remember that old blog sometimes. Which is it's nice when you find someone who tells you, "Oh, I followed you since 2003," and it's like, shit, really?
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Please forget some of that. No, it is truly.
It's bad.
Bizarre.
The website is all bad things.
No,
don't look at it.
Like it is truly bizarre. Anytime there's like a creative, like there's like a VTuber will be like, "I listened to your raps when I was in high school." I'm like, that was a terrible decision. Why did you do that? But then you at the same time you have to be like, that's really cool, and you have to respect that, like you have encouraged people to like. It's one of those things that you kind of have to appreciate that, like, yeah, maybe not everything lined up the way one expected, but if you've nudged somebody else forward into something, that's not everybody gets the chance to do that. The internet was really good for letting folks like you and I do that stuff without sort of any sort of constraint or forethought. We just could just go for it.
It was a lot easier to do it then than it is now. Not only because of the options that existed if you were resourceful, but just the fact that people would go to your website, or you could get people to go to a website. That's the hardest thing now. You make a website that's not in one of the silos. Very difficult to get anybody to care.
It's very the thing is like now it's like hosting's MBD, $5, throw a drop up on DigitalOcean, click the add a blog script, you're good to go. It's not it's a lot easier than it used to be, in many key ways, to the point where it's all like the idea that like if this person learns how to make a blog, they're going to be able to like make a living. It's like, no, because there's no effort in like setting that part of it up. Like the finesse now is in building a brand, because the tech part has been so blessedly abstracted that you don't have to like muck around in a Unix system with FTP permissions and crap like that just to like set up WordPress or B2, right? Yeah. We're in a better era, because I think I even remember one time you're like, what CMS should I use? And I'm like, oh god. Like it's
the entire time it was like my entire time operating that site was just like me constantly asking you and other people I know like random tech questions, just kind of patching it all together and never really understanding how any of it went together in the end, and I still don't. That's at the same time, I guess it's kind of impressive because I was able to without any of that tech knowledge, and for the longest time just riding on anger over shows that didn't air on TV after a certain point would have been years ago, because I got so much mileage out of being angry about not being able to be there not being able to see the prime Toonami years myself and all those shows we missed out on, and at the same time coasting on this complete lack of tech knowledge and just knowing people who could kind of help me out. I guess it's kind of impressive in a way. I guess I should go with a positive spin, maybe.
Yeah. Well, and it's about the connections, right? A lot of this is just, the people who you and I became friends through the forums and through that kind of stuff like that, linked up. Like, when was the first time we met? I was talking about this with Danielle the other day.
The first time we met was SakuraCon 2006, and I ran into you and Sketch and Lance Haskell at the Funimation booth at that con. That's when we all first met.
We're sure it's 2006 because I remember. Because here's me talking timelines. 2003, I go, I think, to my first SakuraCon. Then 2004, it's still at the hotel. 2005, I think, is the first time it's at the convention center.
2006 was the first time I was at the convention center, because that was the first time I went.
Okay, well then, all right, there you go.
And
then I probably the ears shifted a little.
Yeah, and then it was either that summer or the summer after where I met you, or you showed up at Anime Evolution, and I met up with you and Danielle at the Vic Mignogna panel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Which is the most 2007 thing.
It is the most 2007 thing. It's also just really funny, just because it's all like, obviously his whole thing came apart, and the joke is for all of his running around, there was plenty of actually adult people who would have been interested if he just wasn't a dirtbag. Like,
yeah.
I mean, we talk about, like, what did you do with your last 20 years from 2003 to 2023? And I'm like, you know what? No matter wherever the dreams were versus reality we're all doing better than that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, do you think it's possible anybody's listening to this who doesn't know about Vic Mignogna? He's a bad man. Let's just say that he's a bad man who was at anime conventions and did bad things.
He got his ass beat in court because he was dumb enough to sue people who had the receipts on him, and then he got the world's worst lawyer, who then let him put into deposition him basically snitching on himself. And for his attempted lawsuits, he got totally like BTFO like 0 to 23. So yeah, don't have like the easiest bag in the world and fumble it because you're like can't give your female coworkers any respect. Looking back though, it's like I'm sure a lot of people, but like I really appreciate just the way you stuck with Zannen as a brand and as an idea, and then evolving it in the podcast. I always thought that was a real clever way to keep the things rolling into different mediums. And now that we're gradually trying to throw this thing online on YouTube and stuff like that, like the next thing we're gonna have to do is like actually do like video. This could be your next pivot.
So I'm not quite sure.
I'm kidding.
I mean, I was gonna say at the beginning, like 25 years is a better milestone to celebrate. To be perfectly honest, I don't know if I could even keep this podcast going for another 5 years. I think I'm gonna run out of stuff to talk about. Mostly because there's only so many retrospectives I can do. There's only so many things to look back on. Even going back decades that you can really do an episode about. And with the way the landscape of media and the internet is changing, there just might not be anything distinct to say about Canada anymore in the future, depending how things go. We don't know.
I feel like that's a segue to one of your next topics.
Well, we'll get to that in a bit.
Okay.
I got to just to finish off the journey of Zannen Canada. After we were done at Anime Source, I got a guy I knew from the anime club at SFU actually offered to host the site because I wasn't able to keep it on Anime Source after a certain point. I was kind of surprised he offered to do that because we kind of didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but I think he just kind of wanted he had server space and he wanted to use it for something. I don't think he realized that my website was like very active and had lots of traffic, and it kind of became a burden on him. But that was actually one of the better homes Zannen Canada has had, and I felt like the site wasn't weighed down a lot when I had it on there. But that's kind of where things were at the tail end, and I ultimately wound up shutting the site down early 2010, and the reason I always said was because that's when Bionics ended on YTV, and I felt that with the end of Bionics and Crunchyroll starting to dominate the way that people consumed anime, I felt that there just wasn't anything to talk about anymore at that point. Weirdly mirroring what I just said about possibly ending this podcast within the next few years. But the other reason was that I was being kicked off the host, and I just didn't want to bother to find anything new at that point, at least not that would allow me to run the site the way I had been running it up to that point. And I had stripped things down. I took off all the pages talking about specific channels in Canada. It was pretty much just a news blog at that point, where I sprinkled in far too many opinions. I have to say, even in the later days. So I simply pulled the plug on it, and I didn't even actively conserve it or preserve it. It all just went away. I replaced it for a couple of months with a Save the Spectacular Spider-Man website, because that's what I was obsessed with at that time, and I was so infuriated that it had been canceled. And on that note, I do got to point out, did you see Across the Spider-Verse?
I have not had the chance yet. I'm going to probably, much like many things these days, it's going to be something I will eventually get to when it'll come to me. I won't come to it. It'll turn up in my travels or something.
I have to say the cancellation of Spectacular Spider-Man made me so angry. But I just like wrote off Spider-Man for years. I'm just like, I'm done with Spider-Man. But justice has finally been delivered for Spectacular Spider-Man fans with that movie, because not only does he make Spectacular Spider-Man make a cameo with Josh Keaton doing the voice, they actually adapt a scene, like a Spectacular Spider-Man version of a scene from the comics that show didn't actually get to, which I thought was a really cool way to homage that. Not something I ever expected to see from another creative staff, because it always kind of felt like Spectacular Spider-Man never got the respect it deserved from especially like the people who made the Spider-Man movies.
Well, that's the kind of thing, though, is that if there's one Spider-Man, if there's one superhero thing that gets the value of creative input, in variety of creative input, the Spider-Verse films may be literally the only ones that actually get it in terms of Hollywood film. Like everything else is like, we're doing two things to do two things. They're putting things together and drawing influences together because they care. So of course, if anyone was going to do it, was going to be them.
Yeah, Spider-Verse is great because what separates it from other superhero movies is that it's not just adapting the stories or the character arcs or adapting those, quote unquote, adapting those into film. It's adapting the legacy of all of the people who worked on Spider-Man in any kind of creative capacity, the writers, the artists, everyone who worked in the comics, different animated shows, different interpretations. It just kind of acknowledges it as this, for lack of a better term, the brand of Spider-Man is just this living entity, this living, thriving entity that just accumulates from all these different sources, and these movies capture that so well. And it really is a shame that Phil Lord is apparently a giant dick, the way that he manages that production. But a lot of people who make good movies are horrible people, so it's not that surprising.
What are you gonna do?
It's the poor animators in Vancouver are taking the brunt of it yet again, though.
Well, the more of them need to pull lower decks and unionize. Shout out those guys.
Agreed.
Getting that done. And like I said, you showed a lot more commitment to it in some form or the other than I have. Like the last thing I wrote, and I originally pitched it to ToonZone, and it didn't end up there, probably because it is an absolutely unwieldy mess. It's like 5,000 word dissection of Fully Cooley Prague. And I'm obviously glad that I put that on my own website now, because it still exists easily, and it was something that even DeMarco liked. But it's a reminder that's like, that's now pretty far back. And you've
we're getting more Fully Cooley. They're doing more of those for Adult Swim now.
I'll have to see whether one of them's worth another long over analysis. But my guess is that, you're talking about, you may not do this in 5 years, and I'm like, I'm already not doing it, basically. And I basically, around about the time you wrapped up Zannen in 2010, I went back to finally finish up my degree in university, came up to Canada, SFU, all that. And the amount that I wrote just fell off. Like, it was already beginning to fall off. It's like, amount I wrote, amount of those on the form just fell off, because you can't do that when you're doing a STEM degree and you've already done all the undergrad stuff in community college. You're just all I'm doing is taking very difficult coursework. And after having let the prior coursework get a little rusty. And so to see you through master's degrees and so on and so forth, and all the different things, and finding different ways to keep this rolling is truly notable.
It might just be because I had nothing better to do with my time. That's how it started, and maybe the situation's only gotten a little better.
Well, there's certainly worse hobbies.
Yeah. Also I should acknowledge that Zannen Canada was basically non-existent for like 5 years. There was I did replace it with a blog called Sitting on an Atomic Bomb, which was just dreadful, unfocused nothingness that you can just forget about. But yeah, then I brought it back as a podcast in 2015 because I thought, it looks like there's stuff to talk about again, and I can go back and maybe re-explore my very unfinished, unpolished ideas from my youth and turn them into something. And I don't know if I have quite turned them into something. Maybe I'm just still kind of on the negative end of that because I can't make money off of it. But yeah, I think for posterity's sake, I think the podcast has gone well. As I kind of alluded to earlier, I haven't been putting out as many episodes. There have been a few things that people have wanted me to talk about that I didn't want to do a full episode on. I guess we can kind of touch on those now. We started talking about this earlier with Teletoon. How, as I'm sure many of you know, the English-language Teletoon television station is gone. It has been rebranded as Cartoon Network Canada, and Cartoon Network Canada has been rebranded as Boomerang Canada. This does not mean that Teletoon is dead, because there's still the Teletoon Plus app, which you can buy as get as an extension on Amazon Prime, and the French Teletoon is still there. And some might argue that the French Teletoon is in fact the real Teletoon, and that the English Teletoon was just a weird mirror image of the French version. I always kind of saw it that way. It's like you see the French version of Teletoon, and you're like, oh, that's why they did things that way. That's why they aired that weird stuff on the English language Teletoon, because they were just kind of conforming to what they were doing on the French version of the station. And that French version of Teletoon is still it's still very popular and still a pretty big deal to French speaking audiences as well. But I guess despite the fact that it has proven to be a strong brand with English audiences as well, it's gone now, and that just kind of made me think about, for years, if there's one thing that's been consistent with Zannen in Canada over the years, it's been focusing on its negative qualities. But I think there are a lot of positive things to look back on, especially if you go back to like when the station started in like 1997, 1998, when it was born from this regulatory policy experiment of genre protection, where different companies would basically get the right to make a cable station, this uncharted frontier of higher tier cable, to make a station that would be focused on a specific genre and they would have the exclusive rights to control that genre in extended cable in Canada, with the expectation that they would produce original Canadian content. Interesting approach to this. It only kind of worked, but it definitely got interesting results. And those results just kind of got worse over time as those regulations were rolled back and corporate consolidation happened, which is to be expected in Canada, I guess.
It ran into some very weird sort of convergence of forces, because there was obviously eventually things that came out of the CanCon process as critiqued by you and many others that eventually did find its way to the States and found strong audiences. Like, that's, total drama is obviously never going to be something for me, but obviously is something now. Again, we're talking these long time frames. Like, that's somebody's childhoods, and they're adults that pay like taxes now and work a job, and probably because they're a Zillennial or a Zoomer, share an apartment with like 8 other people just to get by. But the fact of the matter is that, did it eventually bear some fruit? It's like, yeah, technically, might have it had borne stuff faster if it had been sort of more free to sort of just like focus on, look, well, we aren't trying to fill a quota. We're just trying to make something good enough that we can then resell to, essentially barter for the purposes of by the end of the day with our American counterparts for, we're going to give you this really good show and then we're going to get something back. And I mean, there is certainly lots of attempts at that with animation and CanCon, even, like Pals with Gran on Nick, that kind of stuff, even before you had things that were more solid hits. But it's just like, it's weird to think that, like it's gone, like that process, because it's like, I don't feel like now something from Cartoon Network Canada that's made for Cartoon Network Canada is going to filter.
I don't think they don't make anything for Cartoon Network Canada.
Yeah.
Like they just fill time with older productions.
Yeah. It's like, I don't see why they would ever make something again. Yeah. Because like the whole idea is that
it's just a monument to the failure of to the ways that CanCon policies have failed in Canada over the years. I say CanCon policies in Canada as if they exist in any other country.
The way native content policies have failed in Canada, or local content policies have failed in Canada.
But there have been successes because, when Teletoon died, the brand recognition was so strong for Teletoon, and people still remember the very earliest days of Teletoon when it was like very distinct, very memorable. Like you look at their old programming bumpers, and they were just wild. Like you wouldn't expect that from any other station today. So, or even then, they really stood out. And their entire approach to having this really diverse schedule with shows from around the world, and other shows that were exported. Like, I mean, hey, Angela Anaconda has always been something that people like to make fun of incessantly, but people still remember it. It is when people talk about it, like, exactly what it is.
Well, else is like, how many cartoons got to be in front of like a Digimon movie, right?
Yeah, that's
like, there was that aspect of putting those things together, saying we need these things to exist, creates these like unexpected opportunities, externalities, where some of that content gets seen by a ton of people who weren't going to be exposed to it otherwise, or it gets bundled into things. It's like Angela Anaconda stuff also came in through like Kablam, through Nick. Like, there's a bunch of these little things that came in through the corners by it existing. So the idea that like, oh man, like, the rough part now is like, that cultural exchange there is just obviously gone with the modern format of it. And there's nothing, to fill in the gaps quite in the same way. You're not going to have, you are much more likely to have a U.S. company paying to have something animated in Vancouver, either because it was non-union or at least because they had the bandwidth. And then it's just for an American IP. Like, Lower Decks is great, but it's just, it's not an opportunity necessarily for local voices to create something with local talent and then say that's of value to the rest of the world. And it is weird that even during that time frame, probably one of the better examples of that was Ed, Edd n Eddy, and that was Cartoon
Which
Network
did not
writing
qualify
blank
as
check.
Canadian content.
Yeah. Despite
because it was funded by, it wasn't funded through the appropriate channels. So
and that's it's like, hey, it's Canadian voice actors, Canadian animators, in a Canadian studio, paying taxes in Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing that happens at the end of the day is, did a Canadian company retain the copyright? Well, probably not. I don't know how ownership of that went between CN and AK at the end of the day, but at the ultimately though, I mean, like, they even made like jokes like Canadians squirt guns in it, right? And they're just talking about turkey basters, and it's just, it's, oh man, it's sort of strange. It is weird to lose Teletoon, but it's also just like, it was built on questionable policy.
I don't think that the policy was maybe questionable, but I think that the results were ultimately good, because I don't think that a station like this unique and memorable would have been able to exist without that experiment.
Yeah. I mean, well, especially because they took they didn't take it for granted that, like, they had to prove themselves, because this was also they had to kind of simultaneously worry about, this is when MTV and Nick were both incredibly experimental as well. Cartoon Network was coming up. But all these, packaging for those blocks, that kind of content there had been wild for years, because you had people like Fred Sabert and all the, like, go listen to it. There's a million YouTube channels to break down all of that dirt in vastly more granular detail than this here. Go watch Pop Arena, everybody, if you've got time after this, and you can get all that in much more explicit detail. But the general point is like, they did not say like, oh, because we have this protection, we don't have to like try. In fact, they pushed it as hard or harder.
As we sort of alluded to, the whole situation with Teletoon was kind of, it was kind of complicated, because it created something that was really interesting.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, its existence prevented Cartoon Network from being able to exist in Canada, which is why we didn't get Toonami. And the people running Teletoon, just for whatever reason, they just didn't want to run anime there, even though they had an adult block, which would have been perfect for it. They just, they would run some OVAs of movies now and again, but TV shows never. And this is part of why I didn't want to do a whole episode focusing on Teletoon dying. Because everything I've wanted to say about Teletoon, I've already said in the episodes that we've done about the manga entertainment stuff that ran on there, in the adult block, Card Captors, which ran in the kids block, and Cyber 6. It's all covered. I think the only really notable TV series that ran sort of as a quote-unquote pure, not heavily localized for kids anime was Naruto in French, which I guess is actually pretty notable. Naruto has had an interesting journey in French Canada. Maybe that is something I should do an episode about in the future. I don't know. I don't know if anybody out there has opinions about Naruto in French. Maybe share them in the comments of my blog. No one ever posts in the comments for the Zannen Canada blog. Tell me all about your story, your background with Naruto in Quebec or in French. I'd love to hear that. Maybe that's worth exploring in the future. But that doesn't matter, because French Teletoon is still there.
Given how much it had already come unglued at Teletoon, was it fair to put it out to pasture at this point in English?
Oh, it didn't actually make any difference. Everything that had made Teletoon what it was, and the in the eras where people cared or thought it mattered, has long been diluted. Just because Teletoon has just been bought out and merged with other companies so many times that everything that made it, the bad and the good of what made Teletoon unique, is just long gone at this point. Like, whatever force was not interested in having anime on Teletoon is gone, but at the same time, everything that kind of made them have interesting programming decisions or
anything else that would have made it at least, okay, you didn't give me this thing, but you gave me else something interesting or something reflective, is also gone.
Yeah, so, again, it's complicated. Complicated relationship with Teletoon here on the Zannen Canada podcast. Much more interesting than the pure hatred of the old Zannen Canada blog, which was childish and immature. But we things are more well considered now.
we're in our, don't it always seem to, go and don't know what we got till it's gone phase, a little bit more mature like that.
Exactly. And I guess another thing that I didn't really want to have a whole episode about was the whole situation that we're seeing, kind of related to what we just talked about with regulatory experiments. But Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, which is going to probably have...
old is new again in that sense.
And
it always loops back to policy.
Yeah, so you probably heard about this. And I think that most people, when they know about regulation of streaming services sort of being impending based on the recently passed legislation, I think most people are fairly neutral on it. If you know anybody who works in like the film or television or animation industry, their opinions are almost definitely going to be more on the positive side. But then you hear a lot of complaining about it, almost all of which is focused on conservative echo chambers, which are painting this as like a censorship bill. And then you have like libertarian leaning tech.
I think that
sort of perspectives which tend to lean more negative to neutral at the same time.
I think there's a sub bubble of that too, where we're in a weird era where there are now YouTube can be not just one person's job. YouTube can be a job that can support companies valued at hundreds of millions of dollars with hundreds of employees, some of which are Canadian. And you get the weird thing where it's like, none of these tax credits ever worked for us ever anyways. So these changes, it's weird to see this is already behind the ball and already just in that section. Cause it's like, how is this going to apply to them as a content creator who then makes their money through a platform that's US based? It's like, question mark.
Well, a lot of the controversy about Bill C-11 was how it would impact quote unquote user generated content.
And user generated content being a really weird scale of stuff now.
But despite the fact that, during the whole legislative process, they were fighting off amendments to address that in the bill. After it all passed, they just the government made a policy directive to the CRTC saying, don't regulate user content, effectively killing that entire basis of criticism against the bill, which I don't understand why they did it that way, but that's what it came down to in the end. And now it's mostly a matter of how you feel about the idea of CanCon, what it is, what it should be, and how it's going to apply to streaming services.
Well, and who can access it? Who can gets back into that thing of like, there's all these sorts of little bonuses and stuff that theoretically, if you can manage the paperwork, any Canadian creator can get. In practice, you got to be like one of these major companies to sort that out. And this redresses none of that. And if the whole idea is smaller voices or what you aren't lifting up, that's a fair criticism of this thing being, cart before the horse. But that's out of pocket for, you telling me to go read the Crunchyroll document about this.
Well, that's the other thing. Obviously, the scope of what services are going to be impacted by this is still a little unclear. I think sort of the vague proposal is that companies that have a gross revenue of $10 million in Canada through streaming revenue could potentially be required to register. And this could potentially, impact anime services or services that people use for anime. And, going back to how regulation impacts anime, as might be expected, Crunchyroll and AMC, who owns High Dive, and Tubi, and, the companies that provide most of the anime through streaming, they did submit interventions. They were a little interesting to look at. So my opinion on this is that I don't think that anime is going to be heavily impacted in any way. Oh, also worth noting that Cinedigm, who owns Retro Crush, didn't even bother to put an intervention in, which I think is probably appropriate because no matter how things shake out, I can't imagine Retro Crush not just slipping through the cracks in all of this because they are so small.
The weird part with Cinedigm is just sort of seeing they're making other changes that happen to be going around at the same time, where it's just like, yeah, they're clearly just focusing all their anime stuff into Retro Crush, like they're killing Con TV anime, or at least I'm not seeing it up here in Canada anymore. But that makes sense if you have Retro Crush as a brand instead. Why would you run 2 streaming channels, some of which, for a while there, both of which had fast channels as well on various and sundry apps, competing for the same set of eyeballs, basically. And actually, at points, I think we're running like Boogie Bop Phantom against each other, dubbed and subbed.
Yeah, what an age we live in.
Yeah, I mean, that's the flip side. Is like, what was a big part of the drive, looping back, big part of the drive behind Zannen as a blog was like just access and getting things. And now, well, it's there. We all have the access. Does this bill impact that?
So if you look at the Crunchyroll submission, it's a little funny because
weird.
It
reads weird.
They're mostly reiterating things or saying like, "Oh, we completely support what the commission is doing." I don't know if it is because they are lazy or just extremely confident, but they don't seem to be concerned about being subject to regulation. The way that they've put this together, they basically just reiterate what Crunchyroll is, a service that provides authentic Japanese anime content, which must be produced in Japan by definition, and be in Japanese. That's more or less how they define it. Yeah. And they're saying that, yep, as you said in your proposed regulations, smaller services that do not have a material impact on the Canadian broadcasting system will be exempt. And it kind of takes it as a given, but I'm also not a lawyer, so
I mean, the other thing is that they're throwing around numbers of like, if you're under 10 million, you probably don't have to care. We know from, I think the merger numbers is like Crunchyroll had like 1 million-ish subscribers or something worldwide. So as a percentage of population, like, yeah, they could easily be under those numbers for revenue for Canada. Yeah. The fact that there aren't any sort of like, there isn't that possibility of that, it's like, it's trickier, I think, maybe for the AVOD players like Tubi, which has to say like, you know what, theoretically a whole bunch of people could be watching enough Tubi because it's so broad audience that maybe they crack $10 million in ad sales in Canada.
There's quite a bit more pushback from Tubi. They're basically saying that any service that relies on advertising should be exempt because they're feeling the heat from this a bit, I think. And honestly, I don't think that this is going to keep Tubi from operating here because they are run by Fox, so it's not like this is just a mom and pop company.
They're run by Fox. I could see where they would be like, well, if we've got to readjust our library rather than trying to commission anything or change what they're buying, I could see them just saying like, all right, how much of the library is basically not being watched anyways, which might unreasonably lean on some of their old anime, and some of that might not be particularly love lost. Well, I miss Arjuna being on Tubi, maybe because every once in a while I want to look at an old shot and be like, that's where Gohan's got it from. They've been doing the same animators been doing the same weird camera tricks for 20 years. Back to that number again.
In this wonderful season of 2 Gohan's animes.
Oh God.
Gracing our eyeballs.
I thought they had learned their lesson with Wise, and like clearly it had just been like Osaka gave them a reason to not screw up. Like they had to focus because there was a city they would have upset that they operate out of and have a giant billboard in for their shows. But clearly the second they're just like, the second they can have like a budget to move the camera around, they do, and they just don't need to. But that's an aside. The point here is that Tubi, they have a lot of weird old stuff on it. Like Dot Hack is up there terribly, but also like Cowboy Bebop's up there. And it's like, what are they going to cut? Well, they'll probably keep some anime, but if they had to sort of rearrange their library, it's going to be the weird fun stuff that, yeah, maybe somebody like Jesse or I has on DVD hiding somewhere. But otherwise, if I want to point somebody to some weird thing or I want to cite it, that just becomes lost media without these AVOD streamers. I think now. I think these things do have a place for, especially as Netflix is more expensive, no longer something you can account share, et cetera, and has a fifth the library of a Tubi, right?
Just to clarify and stress as well, when you're talking about services potentially cutting content because of these regulations. I have to stress it's not because, or stress to the listeners, it's not because it's not Canadian content, because that's not how Canadian content is proposed to work in these regulations. The services aren't expected to have any specific percentage of Canadian content in their library, but regulated services are expected to have Canadian content prominently displayed on the front page of their site. And so that people will find it the same way, that with the same ease that they would find content from the United States, basically, and other countries, but it's really the content from the United States that is the main focus here. And personally, I don't have any problem with that. I see a lot of people grandstanding about the rights of these companies to keep their industry secrets and not have their precious algorithms.
The algorithm stuff is just nonsense anyways.
Yeah,
and it's something as we're seeing as social media comes unglued, as a relevant example here, all of this algorithm stuff's nuts. The fact that Threads launched with algorithms only and no chronological timeline is nuts. The way Twitter has been monkeyed with in all these ways is weird. There's a lot of room for an entity like a government, like the Canadian government, to say, for the purposes of what's being highlighted on your platform, you guys are already, by and large, in no way empowering the user to make any rational decisions on this stuff. It is very telling that effectively the only two platforms out of all this social media implosion that seem to try to provide that is Mastodon and ActivityPub through an almost Linux-like level of technical density and imposingness that is its own constraint, and Blue Sky, which is very much about allowing people to build their own lists and algorithms and share them, and then build their own mute lists so that people can sort of say, like, I don't want to hear from these kind of jerks, and you just that person's reliable. It's very obvious that from those two examples alone, that all of this horse shit from these tech companies about what they do and don't have to do and what they can and the tools they can and can't give you, the user, it's nonsense. So towards that end, in terms of, if you're a big company and you have to highlight some Canadian content because you're making $10 million a year, shut up. Throw a little list at the top. I know if you've got more content than friggin' Netflix at this point, you can throw that stuff up. Is it going to maybe be a stagnant list? Is it not going to necessarily rotate as much as your other what's hot lists? Probably, but it's easy enough to do. And it's not going to drive people off from it because you're an AVOD platform when everybody's broke. People are going to be turning to you no matter what. It
is frustrating to see how many people in the grand discussion of all this seem to think that these tech companies can just do whatever they want, or should be allowed to do whatever they want. And I think that the regulations we're seeing in Canada right now, pushing back on that, even if they're not always doing it in the best way, like we look at the news regulation, that the news the news bill that's gone through recently.
The news bill has gone through recently, but the thing is, like, that's the same stuff that, like, France has passed, very similar stuff that Australia's passed, very similar to stuff that California itself, the home of all these guys, is considering passing. So it ain't that out of pocket.
Doing a link tax is not the best way of doing this, and it could backfire in the future. But it at the end of the day, it's just, you have to, you can't just let these tech companies do what they want. You have to draw the line. They have to contribute to the country that they're in many ways exploiting, the countries and audiences that they're in many ways exploiting with seemingly no consequence for far too long. And I mean, I think a lot of the intolerance that people have towards sort of the established media industry in Canada, apart from like the huge disinformation that is turning people against it, is because of a lot of the mistakes made in regulation in the past.
True. And it's not a great track record, because it is, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it's often behind the ball in terms of, like, who's already pivoted, who's already figured out the other side of this stuff, such that, like, okay, so this is the rule set and I've got to deal with these people. It doesn't matter. I'm still able to build an ongoing concern and grow it as a Canadian-based company, and then share that, be a Canadian face to the world through that as well. Those are opportunities. We have our Canadian influencers in various and sundry verticals and all that, and that's kind of amazing, and that's enabled because of these platforms. But that means that these platforms, obviously, if they can do that kind of thing, if somebody can I shouldn't say exploit them, but can leverage them, because they're being probably more exploited than they're getting leveraged. But the thing is that they can do that. That means that there's pathways there. So there is the aspect of how can the government encourage people to leverage those pathways versus a link tax, for example. How do you make these things optimized from that side? And then how do you sort of make sure that there aren't fingers on the scale otherwise? And that's a different kind of regulation than a link tax. And that's a different kind of regulation than necessarily even saying we need Canadian content specifically highlighted on these pages versus saying this algorithmic kind of stuff has to like hit the bricks. Otherwise, people should be able to drill down more effectively. You need to be able to provide the tools to the user so that they can find the content that they're actually interested in, not what you're trying to shove on them, not what you're trying to get back in the black on because you overspent. You spent $300 million on a movie that was maybe going to only ever make you $100 million in the best of worlds. No. Like all of this, like it's the kind of thing where it's like if there's something to complain about in terms of the regulation, it's not that it's there, it's that is it actually achieving the goal?
Yeah. And going back to the mentality that the original Zannen in Canada was born from 20 years ago, I think that we're definitely better off now because we can still, our anime is not going away. I really don't think that we're going to lose anything that we're getting now as a result of this. And I think there's a potential for, good things to come from it. We could get new programs, new approaches to streaming in Canada could come out of this as well. It's hard to say. It's all a little up in the air right now. We could have another era of experimentation. Also, it could just be more regulatory capture from the usual parties. That's very likely, but
we're already in a weird state just because Canada had been kind of dragging on AVOD advertising. I keep using these things, and I should, in case for the listeners who aren't familiar, advertising supported video on demand, AVOD, FAST, which is free ad-supported streaming television. In other words, linear TV on your streaming device. And Canada had been kind of dragging on that stuff, and suddenly is in the game on that through partnerships with U.S. entities, and that does ultimately provide a bunch of Canadian content a space, including legacy Canadian content, especially a space to continue to have a visibility here in Canada in a constant way, but also in North America and around the world in some cases. So those are the kind of things where it's like, those are the opportunities to be, if there's things that regulations can encourage, as opposed to positive versus punitive kind of approaches here. If there was things to try and push Canadian content into fast channels such that they were then, favorable for Roku, Pluto, etc. to pick up, that's valuable because those are audiences that are just kind of flipping through trying to see something. So if you can be there visible, that is the opportunity to draw people in and not only make sure that Canada gets what Canada needs from Canada, but that Canada is visible to the world.
Yeah, I'm not as big a booster on the AVOD stuff as you are, obviously, but it is a neat little playground, and I think a lot of things can be born from this.
It feels like it's where things are heading, at least in terms of regular TV. Obviously, so much of it, so much of the rest of it is just like people, direct to people through like your YouTubes and stuff like that.
We're getting to the point where I think I wish we'd just go back to regular TV. But
I don't think we're not going to get that.
It's not
That's
happening.
Definitely not happening.
It's not happening.
But knowing that the thing is, if you regulate, knowing that that's a strong possibility, there's an opportunity for particularly for a place like Canada that has the full stack of talent, start to finish, to create, distribute all this kind of stuff. If that's what's getting the backing and getting the uplift, now more than ever, that isn't just you've provided that for here. You provide that for everywhere. and you pull the money back in. You stop being mined, and you starts coming home.
So I think we got to wrap up.
Yeah.
Just before we do, there's one other thing I wanted to mention. I know that one thing that we have brought up constantly over the years is that certain companies like Sentai Filmworks and Discotech don't have distribution in Canada for their home video releases. I am happy to say that Sentai Filmworks stuff actually is now showing up at Sunrise Records.
Wonderful.
Unfortunately, it is off to a rough start. They've only gotten a few in, and they are very expensive. I think you got to drop like $90 on Made in Abyss Season 2, which is pretty, even...
you know what? That's some 2003 prices.
That is some 2003 prices, for sure. 2003, like, Genion in Canada prices. I will say that, that really sucks, but these stores have, like, really screwed up ways in determining what products they carry from what companies and what distributors, and by actually buying the stuff they do get in probably will help them get more stuff in the future and maybe figure out better pricing schemes. So, I mean, if you got money to burn and don't mind spending a little more on the Sentai titles they get in at Sunrise, I say go pick them up.
Get while the getting's good.
Yeah,
you never know what
exactly.
you never like this. One of the things, again, think about 20 years is just like how much of the stuff you get a chance to pick up, and not necessarily. We've been lucky. Companies like not Retro Crash, I should say, but because they're leveraging the work that Discotech is doing. We've been very lucky that some of these things have gotten very loving, very incredible reissues with a lot of hardworking people working on them. But that's not for everything. And so, as these things come out, pick them up and pick them up in stores, because those stores do not last. The anime stores I was hanging around in 20 years ago, when I wasn't busy chatting with you on forums and stuff, all that's gone. And not just gone like, the store moved locations. No, the store went out of business. The lot was leveled, and they built a skyscraper on top of it.
Any anime stores that are left now, they're basically just figurine stores. They're all becoming very samey, and there are like Umomo in at least one of the locations in Vancouver. Like, they are now carrying anime figures, so they're getting in on that. So, I mean, there is sort of a future way forward for those places, but it's all becoming very samey. It's not like it used to be where you could, you go to the anime store to buy anime. Those days are done.
But it's worth still doing, because you don't know what these streaming services and stuff can keep, even in the absence of zero regulation. You never know when a large multinational corporation might decide, hey, if we literally just throw all of these things in a river, we get a tax write-off. And Sony's a large multinational corporation. They own Crunchyroll, so and Sentai's owned by AMC, which is also a giant corporation. Get while the getting's good, kids.
I mean, AMC and Haidai have already killed Pantheon. It's gone, written off.
Yep.
Burned off the face of the earth. You can only pirate it now.
Yep.
And it had only been available for a few months. So, expect more of that. And on that note, we are going to wrap up. Carl, thanks so much for
This has been great
on.
being back on for the first time in a while.
This has been a great discussion. I just had random things I wanted to talk about, and it all actually came together very well. So, Carl, what are you up to these days, and where can people find you online?
Well, I am still at all the same old places, still at ultraclastron.com, ultraclastronbandcamp.com, carlrolson.com. I'm still on various social platforms. I'm trying to focus on Blue Sky for right now, because the vibes are pretty immaculate. If for some reason you're listening to this episode in the future and Threads has won, we're in the terrible timeline. We live in a dystopia. I only hope it's at least cyberpunk and cool.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to Zannen Canada. If you've been with us since 2003, thank you for sticking around for so long.
Bless you.
I cannot express my appreciation enough. You can reach me on Twitter at jbetteridge, on Blue Sky, jbetteridge.bsky.social. I think that's how you are supposed to say Blue Sky.
I'm cool, and I use my domain name because I went and set up the thing to use my domain name.
Right.
Though I didn't get as good a handle as our buddy Corey. I'll leave that as an exercise to the listener. Into 20 more years of Zannen Canada, Jesse.
We should have had Corey on this episode. I didn't think to ask him. But
can't believe we've done this.
Anyway, you can also email me, zonnencanada@gmail.com. I never get emails. If you want to email me on this special occasion, that'd be really great. I love it.
Send your birthday wishes to the podcast, the website. Yeah. It's been old enough to drink for a year, and nobody has bought it a drink.
Anyway, the theme song is by Karl here. You can find it on his album Packet Flood at ultraclystron.com. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast app of choice. See you again.
See you, everybody.
One thing that I meant to mention in the last episode, where we talked about Crying Freeman, was that he was in the last episode of the Crying Freeman OVA, because it was most of it was done by Streamline, but they never got to dub the last episode. But ADV picked it up and dubbed that last episode with their mostly their in-house guys, and one of them was Vic Mignogna. One of his role in that episode is just this guy who's masturbating. Just out while a bunch of people are getting killed around him, and he uses his Junpei voice from Persona 3. So it's funny going back 20 years to look at that, and you're just like, oh, this is he was actually at his most Vic right from almost day one.
Method.